Paul Martin to discuss integrating their three countries.
The Bush administration's open borders policy and its decision to ignore the enforcement of this country's immigration laws is part of a broader agenda. President Bush signed a formal agreement that will end the United States as we know it, and he took the step without approval from either the U.S. Congress or the people of the United States.
At the time of the Waco meeting, the CFR produced a document, Building a North American Community, which called for the creation by 2010 of a community to enhance security, prosperity, and opportunity for all North Americans. Regional alliances like the EU and SPP are not the end game, simply stepping stones to a one-world government. Leading establishment figure Zbigniew Brzezinski said in 1995, "We cannot leap into world government in one quick step. The precondition for genuine globalization is progressive regionalization." Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin recognized this principle as integral to communist plans for domination, saying,
"Populations will more readily abandon their national loyalties to a vague regional loyalty than they will for a world authority. Later, the regionals can be brought all the way into a single world dictatorship."
This is what the war on terror is designed specifically to accomplish, to keep people in a state of fear, of always looking around the corner for the boogeyman, always looking around the corner for the monster that's about to gobble us up. When people's mindset is in that state of fear, they're not making accurate decision-making processes, but moreover, what they're psychologically looking for is a protector.
So here's an interesting story. During 2012, all the presidential candidates, all their surrogates were coming to Ohio. And I had the privilege of being able to interview President Obama and also the privilege of interviewing Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan. And it was during the Mitt Romney-Paul Ryan interview, when I went in to interview them, you get 5 minutes with the candidate, you go into the room, it's basically a stream of media coming in and out the whole time. What's fascinating is I went into that interview with Romney and Ryan, and I sat down on a bar stool, and they were both on bar stools in front of me, the backdrop behind them. And what was a little bit different about this is while there were a lot of people in the room, and that always happens, there was one guy in particular on a sofa behind me who was sitting there as I walked in. And so I sat down, we start the interview. Now what's a little bit different about this is typically when you're interviewing someone, it's a one-on-one interview. In this case, it was two-on-one. And so I would, ask one a question and then to the other one, back and forth. What was really interesting to me was as I was talking with them and interviewing them, I would notice out of my peripheral vision, I'm talking with Congressman Ryan, and I could see Governor Romney looking past me at the guy on the sofa behind him. And then when I would turn to Governor Romney and I would interview him, I could see Congressman Ryan doing this. And if you go back, by the way, and you watch the actual full interview, I would tell people, just go back and watch not the guy I'm talking to, watch the other candidate and how they're looking past me at this guy. And it was almost like they're doing, baseball signals at each other. And so they're, kind of go through this. We do the interview, we're all done. And after I left, I was really interested in who the guy was on the sofa behind me. And so I stopped one of the press people on the way out and I said, "Oh, by the way, who was the guy on the sofa?" And they told me his name, which at the time didn't mean anything. And then they said, "Oh, he's with the Council on Foreign Relations and he's advising the candidates." And when he said it, now that got my attention because they said it as if it was a very positive thing, right? Which is, well, Governor Romney needs more experience on foreign issues and foreign affairs. So it's a good thing. In my opinion, of course, it was, oh, great. So you have someone from this globalist think tank who is basically sitting behind me during an interview and letting them know what they should and should not say. So it was kind of an interesting experience.
The freedom of the press and the freedom of religion were supposed to be two of the greatest vanguards of liberty for the country, according to our First Amendment.
The purpose of the broadcast media, or the controlled, formerly mainstream media, has always been to be a propaganda tool for the government, for the superclass. And you can see how this works in a very simple sense in America with the White House and access to the White House press room. If you don't toe the line, if you're not official corporate media, it doesn't matter how big your audience is, we're going to control the conversation. If you can be an appropriate mouthpiece for government, if you're not going to challenge the paradigm of statism, we will give you access.
Americans today are disenfranchised and disempowered because we don't have enough of the relevant information.
Read the quotes from Katie Couric and saying that they got pressure from the administration.
I can't think of a worse scenario for the future of freedom.
If this documentary is true, why are its claims almost never discussed in mainstream media? After all, the Constitution mandates freedom of the press. How could so many news organizations fail to notice the stories we've discussed?
That's because the information we do get has been filtered and framed in particular ways. It can be easily seen in the mainstream media.
You have a mentality within your newsrooms in which people really do honestly believe if networks don't talk about it, it's not a story. So if Fox isn't saying it, if NBC's not saying it, CNN or ABC, if they're not saying it, it can't be true.
Although America has a free press in principle, this does not guarantee accuracy of the press. To achieve its objectives, the establishment always knew it needed to control the media, the primary molder of public opinion.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
We do have people who submit pieces to American journals.
The national news media is, for all intents and purposes, a totally controlled medium. A free and independent press at the national level just does not exist.
You have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to the national news services, AP and UPI?
Well, again, I think we're getting into the kind of detail, Mr. Chairman, that I'd prefer to handle in executive session.
You know, people will say, why isn't the media doing their job? I beg to differ. The media is doing exactly what they are designed and paid to do. They are steering public perception in the way that the people at the current positions of power want the public perception to go in.
Not continuing
Congresswoman Harman, let me interrupt you.
Congresswoman,
let me interrupt you just for a moment. We've got some breaking news out of Miami. Stand by, if you will. Right now in Miami, Justin Bieber.
They are the mind molders. They are the opinion molders of America. And if you ask a guy some of the technical questions like you've asked me in the last few minutes on the street, you'll hear him reciting something that Rush Limbaugh or somebody else said on radio or TV.
In the 19th century, August Belmont was a Rothschild financial agent in the United States. With J.P. Morgan, Belmont helped finance Adolph Ochs, who purchased the New York Times, then a tiny newspaper with a circulation of 9,000. International banking behind him, Ochs transformed the Times into the world's most powerful newspaper. Ownership passed from Ochs to his son-in-law Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, member of the CFR, then to Orville Dreyfus, CFR, then to Arthur Ochs Sulzberger, CFR.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. You ignore the story because, number one, it doesn't fit with their own personal worldview. There are too many people with the same worldview sitting in those positions. I don't blame Brian Williams for not being interested in covering a story that challenges the globalist thinking of the CFR. I really don't, because he's entitled to his own belief system. The problem is when Brian Williams then prevents any stories that challenge his worldview from being a part of that newscast. And when Brian Williams does it, then Diane Sawyer does it, and so does Scott Pelley, and it goes on and on and on. And then when all the networks say, well, let's ignore those stories, all the local TV stations around the country say, well, they're not covering it, so it must not be a story, because those guys are the most professional, most legitimate media.
The Times editorial policy has consistently paralleled the establishment's agenda. When members of Congress opposed Paul Warburg's nomination to the Federal Reserve Board, the Times lobbied on his behalf. When communist Fidel Castro was trying to seize Cuba in 1959, a series of articles by New York Times reporter Herbert L. Matthews, CFR, persuaded Americans that Castro was the George Washington of Cuba. By 1962, Castro had Soviet missiles pointed at America. During the Vietnam War, the Times demoralized the public by publishing an alleged expose of the war's origins, the Pentagon Papers, a leaked Defense Department study. Leslie Gelb, who oversaw the study, went on to be a Times correspondent and editor. So will Gelb do an expose of the CFR? It's not likely anytime soon. He was the council's president for 10 years and remains president emeritus.
If you're one of those CFR members of the news media, if you're Brian Williams, who's a member of the CFR, if you're Aaron Burnett, who's a member of the CFR, if you're sitting there in your newscast that night and some story comes across about, we should look into the Federal Reserve Bank, you're probably not going to do that. You're going to ignore that. If people are protesting the Federal Reserve Bank, are we going to talk about that? No, we're not going to.
Innumerable Times executives, editors, and reporters have been CFR members. The Times won't expose the CFR because they both belong to the same hierarchy. A similar picture can be sketched of other major news organizations. Media diversity is an illusion.
People get caught up in debating if MSNBC has a better perspective than Fox News or ABC, NBC. These are a very narrow window of information.
Here's your news, here's the report on what's happening through the Republican lens, through the liberal lens, but they're not getting down to the roots and down to the basics and saying, here's the true fundamental problems in society and here's the true solutions.
There is this illusion in America we have a diverse media because we have so many diverse outlets, and a person might say, well, I know this story is true because I saw it on America Online, and then I turned on my television and CNN said the exact same thing. And then later in the week I got my Time magazine and it said the exact same thing. Now, when a story has been confirmed by independent news outlets like that, it must be true. Well, here's the problem. Until the recent AOL spinoff, America Online, CNN, and Time magazine were all owned by one corporation, Time Warner.
At the national level, it's a surprising small number of people that control the vast majority of the national news media.
It's no surprise that you're not going to see any of this in the mainstream media, because the mainstream media is owned and controlled by 5 major corporations.
The New York Times Company owns the Boston Globe. The Washington Post Company owns Newsweek. Disney owns ABC. CBS owns Simon & Schuster. Time Warner owns AOL, CNN, Time, Warner Brothers Studios, HBO, New Line Cinema, Sports Illustrated, People, Fortune, Money, and dozens more. News Corporation owns the Wall Street Journal, Fox Television, London's The Times, Barron's, HarperCollins, Zondervan, Hulu, and the New York Post and scores of other media outlets.
When you have one corporate owner, you're going to get one viewpoint. You don't get a diverse view unless you have diverse ownership.
I got a communication from someone who's in a 3-letter network, head of a news department for that 3-letter network, and said, my family member is in Iraq now, and I was so disturbed at what you said last night about depleted uranium. I don't want to believe this is true. And I said, it is. I gave the evidence, the information, and he said, yes, I've been up all night studying it. You are right. He said, I wish I could tell the people this. And I said, and why can't you? And he said, it's not part of the political paradigm.
Most of America's major media is owned by around a dozen multinational corporations. These, in turn, have directors that interlock through membership in the CFR. Thus, the establishment can guarantee the public receives a uniform viewpoint.
The mainstream media will not cover many of these issues in part because of the people who pay to sponsor their television shows. When you have major corporations that are doing pretty disgusting things to the mainstream public, paying to have TV exist, they're not going to want the commentators discussing about the things that they are doing and how they're awful.
You're not going to see the truth in mainstream media, and in fact, you're going to see disinformation agents. You'll see people like me smeared in the media. If it comes out at all, the information that we're talking about, you're going to find that it's marginalized.
Once a year, the world's elite